Welcome, everybody, to a breaking news edition of the Tailgate. I'm Ralph Vacchiano alongside John Jastremski with the news that Joe Judge is fired as Giants coach after two pretty lousy seasons. Not much of a stunner given his record, but a little bit of a surprise given that it looked like the Giants were waiting to get rid of him until they hired a new GM to let them weigh in. But all of that went out the window after Joe Judge met with John Mara and Steve Tisch on Monday, and then again with John Mara on Tuesday afternoon, which is when he was informed of the decision. And a lot of fans are going to be happy, John. A lot of people were really down on Joe Judge, but the flip side of that is the Giants are now looking for yet another head coach after firing a third one in less than 2 seasons. That's chaos for this team.
Totally get that, Ralph. And it's amazing that a franchise as proud as the New York Giants have basically been churning through head coaches from McAdoo to Shermer and now Joe Judge. But make no mistake, this is the right course of action for this franchise. And I have to wonder, going through the initial read, the process of the GM search, I wonder if the conversation regarding Joe Judge's future came up and the GM prospective candidate said, look, we want this job. We want to start with a slate clean. We want to do it our way and hire our own head coach. I get the feeling the Giants were very receptive to that, and I think they're getting it right because now they're going to have a GM coming in and a head coach coming in on the exact same timetable. They're going to be tied at the hip. They're going to be partners through thick and thin, and I like the way the Giants are going about it from that standpoint. I get the idea of bashing not having continuity, but when you don't win, you want to have your GM and your head coach tied together. Now the Giants will have that.
John, you make a really good point about the GMs wanting to bring in their own coach, because from what I'm told, most of the candidates at least asked or had their representatives, if they have one, ask, are we going to have a chance to make a head coach decision? And they were told that, this is not, it's not a lock that Joe Judge is here. We're going to discuss it with you. So the Giants owners certainly had to know that there were going to be some questions about whether the GMs wanted to work with Joe Judge. Before we move on, I just want to read you the statement that the Giants released. This is a quote from John Mara. He said, "Steve Tisch and I both believe it is in the best interest of our franchise to move in another direction." He said that they met with Joe yesterday afternoon and again this afternoon. And John Mara said it was during that conversation that he told him of his decision. And he said, and this is the money graph here, "I said before the season started that I wanted to feel good about the direction we were headed when we played our last game of the season. Unfortunately, I cannot make that statement." And, if you had asked John Mara, from everything I was told 4-5 weeks ago, he might have made that statement. He might have said, I like this coach. I think he's got a plan. I think we're, even though things are going wrong, I think we're going to get this right. But those last 6 weeks, John, became so embarrassing on the field, in the press conferences. They literally were a national joke. And I think somewhere during there, John Mara just said, this cannot go on any longer.
It 1000% played a role. That bizarre end to the press conference in Chicago. Then you consider the opponents the Giants played over the final 2 weeks of the year. They played a Bears team that fired their head coach, that fired their GM. They didn't belong on the same field with that Bears team. They're not the 85 Bears, they're the 2021 Bears. The Washington football team, they were a hot mess going into that game. And then you got the Giants running quarterback draws on their own 2-yard line when they were a 4-win football team. The optics were terrible. The empty seats, I'm sure, in the regular season finale absolutely played a role. And Ralph, you nailed it. At the beginning of this year, the Giants thought they had their head coach for the next 5, 6, 7 years. John Mara said to members of the media, I don't want to keep hiring and firing coaches. I'm sick and tired of doing that. But it got so rotten for the Giants, so bad for the Giants. By the end of this year, knowing that you were dismissing Dave Gettleman, it just made too much sense. I'm surprised it took him a day, but ultimately, I think the Giants are doing the right thing here.
Now, I will say this, because there might be a few viewers that will remember that not long ago, I wrote a column making a case for Joe Judge to come back for a third year. I cannot defend his coaching. I can't argue with this decision, given how bad it got. My concern is, one is the continuity. I mean, Joe Judge said this isn't a clown show organization. Well, if you're on your 4th coach or now 5th coach since Tom Coughlin's last year in 7-8 years, you're a clown show organization. So that's number one. The other is I don't know that I fully blame Joe Judge for all of this. He lost his starting quarterback for 6 games, Barkley for a lot of it, Galladay for a lot of it. The offensive line, 3/5 of that was gone at the start of the year. I'm not saying he did a good job by any stretch because he should have made this competitive, but he might have been dealt one of the all-time worst hands with this team. And they're basically saying to him, you screwed it up even worse than we thought you would.
Yeah, and I think a major knock, though, is going to be the lack of progress that we saw offensively. And I get it, Ralph. They didn't have Daniel Jones for the final 5 or 6 games of the year. But then you see a team like the Detroit Lions that's playing with a backup quarterback. They're one of the worst teams in the NFL. And yet, not every week, but a couple of games, you saw them go and put up 28 points on occasion, look like a functional, competent NFL offense. The Giants looked like they were running an offense the final 5, 6 weeks of the year like it was out of 1963, for goodness sakes, in this offensive age, in this offensive era of football. I think that is an impossible sell to ownership. And the fact that they knew they were making a change at general manager. Do you think differently if you're bringing this same GM back? Maybe. But guess what? The results are what they are. Bill Parcells once said, you are what your record says you are. And the Giants, listen, over the last 7, 8 years, they've made a lot of terrible decisions from a personnel standpoint. They haven't gotten coaching hires right. And now everything to me is on the table moving forward. And it has to be about the idea of get the GM, let the GM give his input. I know that ownership wants to sign off on the head coach. That's fine. But you really want to have this head coach and the GM on the exact same page. There's no clash. There's no conflict. Listen, inevitably, there's going to be some of that over the course of a working relationship. But at the beginning of this courtship, Ralph, they got to be on the same page here. It's such a must for this franchise.
I completely agree with all of that. And it does make me wonder, what was this dog and pony show all about if this was going to be the end result? Why wait and have meetings with him and then another day of meetings with him? Clearly, my reporting was the same as everybody else's, which is that they were intent on letting the GMs weigh in. They thought that Joe Judge wasn't necessarily safe, but they were going to see if there was anybody that would work with him, see if their preferred candidate had somebody else in mind. But if you're just going to do this now, and even if it's the right decision, why not yesterday? Why not 2 weeks ago to get a head start on some of this as well? They could have certainly did what they did with Jerry Reese and Ben McAdoo, fired both of them with 4 weeks to go in the season. And then they've got a head start on everybody in this search. They just, by messing around like this, they put themselves a little bit behind the 8 ball here.
It's a very fair point, but it does make me wonder about the final game of the regular season, the press conference we heard after the Bear game, and the fact that now the search has begun for general manager candidates. I don't know why it didn't 2 or 3 weeks ago. I guess they could have announced that officially Dave Gettleman's retiring. Let's get a head start on things.
Right. That was no surprise.
To do so. You're right. They absolutely should have gotten a head start in thinking about, well, who do we want? How are we going to go about this and kind of take it from there? But I think, Ralph, they sat down and had their first interview, and one of their top candidates might have said to them, or they heard from other candidates that they're going to meet with, look, you want us to seriously consider taking this job, we need to have input on who the head coach is going to be. And we don't want to wait a year. We don't want to have a lame duck type of status. We want to come in, our plan, our philosophy with the coach we want.
I think you and I agree on this, that this probably is the best case scenario. If you've got a new GM and a new philosophy and new everything else, you may as well let him start fresh. Because even if, as I made the case for Joe Judge to stay, I even knew bringing him back puts him on a 1-year tryout, basically. And chances are, unless this team had a miraculous turnaround, he would have been gone next year. So at least this way, you're starting over fresh. Whoever's in charge, Joe Shane, Ryan Poles, whoever it is, they get a clean slate to look at this whole thing, and hopefully maybe some patience, which the Giants really haven't shown much of in recent years.
Well, and think about this, Ralph. Their cap situation is as bad as can be. This allows the new regime to come in and basically say, you know what? We're blowing this bad boy up. We're going to take our lumps maybe for a year, but we are going to get ourselves set up from a cap space standpoint, from a roster standpoint, to do what we need to do. And I think this basically eliminates the idea of the Giants going and trying to have a quick fix for next season. I think that is now completely out. And I advocated that. Listen, I've always been a fan of Russell Wilson. It's a quarterback-driven league. He's a star. I think that is now 1,000% out. You got a new GM coming in and a new head coach, and this cap situation, they're going to say, hey, let's start from the beginning. Let's give us some time and do what we need to do.
It is a little bit more of an attractive situation now, for sure, I would think, for those GM candidates, especially guys who have options. Joe Shane and I think Rand Carthon, two guys they were looking in or are looking to interview, also are being interviewed by the Bears. So there could be some competition there. JJ, do you now have, we talked about this yesterday, about favorites for who could be the Giants general manager. Do you have a favorite GM/coach pairing that you'd like to see the Giants pursue?
Well, you mentioned Shane, and if you could pair him with Brian Daboll, who, by the way, I think would be a tremendous head coaching candidate for the Miami Dolphins. You got guys coming from the same building, same infrastructure. Daboll has worked everywhere. I mean, he was with Belichick in New England. He spent a year in Miami. He spent a year in Kansas City. He groomed Tua at Alabama. He's done a masterful job with Josh Allen. Think about where Josh Allen was as a quarterback before Brian Daboll took over as offensive coordinator. He was raw. He was not accurate. He looked like a project. Brian Daboll deserves a lot of credit for taking Josh Allen and transforming him into a top-flight quarterback in this league. Now, I love Brian Flores, Ralph. You know that. I'm a Brian Flores guy. I thought he did a fabulous job with the Dolphins. I was stunned he got fired. But I got to wonder, with the reports that are coming out in Miami about the 3 offensive coordinators in 3 years, and he is a guy, he's a my way, the highway type of guy. Who is the GM that Brian Flores is going to work with that he has that sort of relationship with? I mean, I don't see the Giants. I could be wrong on this. After dealing with a New England assistant who did not work out in Joe Judge, Flores, different guy, his own person, but has a lot of those characteristics that he's bringing to the table. Does that scare off the Maras? It could. Now, it wouldn't scare me off. I just got to know who the GM is going to be that Brian Flores can work with. Because I don't know if I'm in love with the idea of taking Brian Flores and making him the GM, the head coach, and just giving him all that power. I don't know if I'd be willing to do that yet.
I think actually, I'm not sure about this, but Monty Ossenfort, the Titans executive who is going to interview for the job, was with the Patriots. I think he overlapped a little with Brian Flores. And that doesn't mean he likes him or that they're close, but there could be a connection there. I don't think Brian Flores has any other connections that I know of to any of these candidates. He's going to be a popular choice among the fans, I think. Roberto on Facebook has already mentioned in the comments that he would like to see the Giants go after Brian Flores. I've heard that from a lot of other people, but I think you're right. You're going to replace a tough-minded, old-school Bill Belichick assistant who wore out his welcome in 2 years with another hard-nosed, tough former Bill Belichick assistant who wore out his welcome quickly, even though he won down in Miami. That's going to open up a lot of questions. I think a lot of people are going to suddenly center on the one you mentioned, Joe Shane, who I think is high on the Giants list on their of their interview candidates, a guy that they really like. I've heard good things about from inside the organization. And Brian Daboll will obviously be paired with him. I know Leslie Frazier, their defensive coordinator, is another one up there, but Brian Daboll would be the guy that comes to mind as maybe someone who can help fix this offense and fix Daniel Jones. So I suspect you'll see a lot of that talk. And I wonder, since Shane is the first interview tomorrow morning, if he says, hey, I can get Daboll, I can do this, I wonder how much they move the process up a little bit and get going quickly, because Daboll's got a couple of other interviews, and obviously Shane has another one too.
Well, Daboll has an interview in Chicago, and he has an interview in Miami. And remember, he had ties to the Dolphin organization when he was an OC back in 2011. So the people within that building probably know a thing or two about him. I think it starts, though, first, Ralph, before we start speculating about head coaches, I think we really have to focus on the GM, because they are not, I don't get the sense the Giants would be foolish enough now to go and hire a head coach before they have a GM. I can't see them going about it in that way with the news that just broke a few minutes ago regarding Joe Judge. I think they're starting with the GM. They're going to let him pick the head coach, and then it's kind of going to go from there.
A new GM obviously is going to have his own ideas about how to build a franchise. Do you see, knowing the needs of this team and the state of this franchise and the fact that they don't have any money in free agency to spend, do you see the draft strategy changing at all? Or is it just going to be exactly what we expect, which I'm guessing is offensive, defensive lines ahead of almost everything else.
Well, I think it gives the new regime a free year on Daniel Jones. Now, look, if there's a quarterback that they are head over heels over, then maybe that is something they bring to the table. I don't know what the new hierarchy of the Giants is going to be thinking about this quarterback class, but most people you talk to around the NFL, they don't regard this class the way they did last year's and the way they did the year before that. So my guess would be they're not taking a quarterback in the first round. They'll probably have Jones, and I think they'll bring there's a very good chance, Ralph, they go with a veteran quarterback market. There are a lot of veteran names that could be out there. Don't be surprised if they bring somebody in who's competition. But again, those questions will have far more clarity once you know what organization they're coming from and what their philosophies are and who they like and who they don't. Like right now to say, oh, Daniel Jones will be, the undisputed starter for the New York Giants. I can't say that. I don't know who's calling the shots.
Right. The veteran quarterback, that's something I've been touting for a while. You look at like a Marcus Mariota or somebody like that to bring in, not an old guy, an Andy Dalton or Joe Flacco, who's just there to, back him up and fill in an emergency. But a guy, like you said, who could be some competition. And there are some interesting names out there. I don't know that they can afford any of them, but is there one in particular that you'd like to see them bring in?
I'm going to go and give you a name that's a crazy old dude, but he is somebody that will light a fire under your rear end. How about Ryan Fitzpatrick?
Not a bad idea. He can
you know what
play.
I mean? If you're looking to just have somebody who can step in a pinch, he's been here, he's done that, he's been in basically every city known to man. Hey, that's a good piece of competition for Daniel Jones. You want to light a fire? Fitzy, players love him. He competes his tail off in practice. He's going to try and win the job from you. He's not going to say, oh, I'm here to back up. He's going to say, no. I'm here to win the job. If you're looking to really get the most and the best out of Daniel Jones, something to think about there. And I'm not concerned about playing favorites at this point, Ralph, because look at the results over the last 8 or 9 years. I'm not looking to play nice. They're not winning football games. Sometimes you need a little competition within a building.
Oh, the leash on Jones has to absolutely be short next year. I think this guarantees, even if they were dumb enough to think about it, they're not picking up his 5th-year option. They're not going to commit anything to him beyond the end of this year. And really, other than maybe I'd like to see him and what he is. So if you want to go into the next season as the starter for a few weeks, that's great, but he better show it very, very quickly, because you're exactly right. There's nobody in this organization now that will be committed to him. That was Dave Gettleman's thing. He was committed to Daniel Jones. We never really knew where Joe Judge stood, but the new guy coming in, maybe not immediately, but from what I'm told, and I'm not smart enough to evaluate this far out, from what I'm told, the 2023 draft class of quarterbacks is a heck of a lot better than the 2022 class. So there's always another one around the corner. And I think they're going to have to get a very quick evaluation of what they really think Daniel Jones is.
Yeah, and I think the best way to go about that is with competition, because remember, there's also a quarterback who can't stay on the field. I mean, that is a major, major knock on him. Fair, unfair, fluke injury, non-fluke injury. You got to be able to play if you're going to be at the best of your craft. You're going to be a legitimate starter in this league. And, there's just not enough of a body of work. There's not enough games to say with certainty, hey, this is a guy could start for 10 years, or this is a guy who needs to be replaced.
It's going to be a fascinating year. It's going to be a fascinating few weeks. We probably got the Giants begin their interviews for general manager this week, all virtual. Next week, they'll bring back some finalists. Then they get into their coaching search. We probably got about a couple of weeks of this, and I'm sure we'll be back here again to discuss it. JJ, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. We have a live tailgate, believe it or not, tomorrow for everybody out there. It'll be a Jets recap show. They're not nearly as interesting, but we got a lot to talk about there. They're much more optimistic, and we're going to keep covering this story. Stay tuned to SNY.TV and all our platforms. We will have a lot more on the Giants in the coming weeks. For John Jastremski, I'm Ralph Vacchiano. Thanks for watching, everybody.